The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as spectators filled every available seat. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice, their chants barely audible through the thick courthouse walls. Inside, the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. This was the case that had captured the nation's attention for months. Marcus Thompson sat at the defendant's table, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. His left leg, fitted with a prosthetic below the knee, was positioned carefully under the table. Despite the gravity of the charges against him, his expression remained steady, almost serene. The 45-year-old veteran had seen worse days than this. The charges were serious: assault on a police officer and destruction of public property. The incident had occurred 3 months earlier, during a heated confrontation outside a veterans clinic. According to the prosecution, Marcus had attacked Officer Bradley Hayes when the officer tried to remove him from the premises. Security footage showed Marcus striking the officer and damaging a patrol car's windshield with his walking cane. But Marcus's lawyer, Sarah Chen, knew there was more to the story. She had spent countless hours preparing his defense, learning about his military service, his struggles with PTSD, and the circumstances that led to that fateful day at the clinic. Sarah believed deeply in her client's innocence, or at least in the justification for his actions. The prosecution painted Marcus as a dangerous man who had lost control. They argued that his military training made him especially dangerous when he snapped. The lead prosecutor, District Attorney William Patterson, was known for his tough stance on law and order. He had built his career on high-profile convictions and had no intention of letting this case slip away. As the morning session began, Judge Robert Harrison entered the courtroom. The bailiff called everyone to order, and the familiar ritual of justice commenced. Judge Harrison was a respected figure in the legal community, known for his fairness and attention to detail. At 62, he had presided over countless cases, from petty theft to murder trials. His graying hair and lined face spoke of decades spent weighing evidence and delivering verdicts. What no one in the courtroom knew was that Judge Harrison carried his own military past. 25 years earlier, he had served as a young lieutenant in the Army, deployed to a conflict zone that had shaped his understanding of duty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Those memories rarely surfaced in his daily life as a judge, buried beneath years of legal precedent and courtroom procedure. The prosecutor began his opening statement with dramatic flair. He described the events of that March afternoon when Marcus had allegedly lost control outside the Veterans Affairs Clinic. According to Patterson, Marcus had been denied certain benefits and had become increasingly agitated with the staff. When security called the police, Officer Hayes had arrived to find Marcus shouting and waving his cane threateningly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Patterson declared, his voice echoing through the courtroom, "this case is about a man who took the law into his own hands, a man who used violence when he didn't get what he wanted. The defendant may be a veteran, and we thank him for his service, but that service does not give him the right to assault a police officer." The prosecutor clicked through photographs on a large screen, showing Officer Hayes's bruised face and the damaged patrol car. He emphasized the severity of the officer's injuries and the cost of repairing the vehicle. The images were powerful, and several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus listened to the prosecution's version of events without visible reaction. He had heard it all before during the preliminary hearings. The facts were largely accurate, but they missed the crucial context that had driven him to that desperate moment. His eyes occasionally drifted to the gallery, where a small group of fellow veterans sat in support. They understood what the prosecutor and most of the courtroom could not. Sarah Chen rose for the defense opening statement, her approach notably different from the prosecution's dramatic presentation. She spoke quietly, forcing the jury to lean in and listen carefully. She began by acknowledging that Marcus had indeed struck Officer Hayes and damaged the patrol car, but she promised to show why those actions were not criminal. "Marcus Thompson is not a violent man," she began. "He is a decorated combat veteran who gave his leg and his peace of mind in service to this country. What happened that day was not a criminal assault, but the desperate act of a man pushed beyond his breaking point by a system that had failed him repeatedly." She outlined Marcus's military record: 3 tours of duty, a Bronze Star for valor, and the improvised explosive device that had ended his career and left him with chronic pain and PTSD. She described his struggles with the VA system, the denied claims, the bureaucratic maze that had left him without proper medical care for months. The defendant did not wake up that morning planning to hurt anyone, Sarah continued. He went to that clinic seeking help, seeking the care he had been promised and had earned through his sacrifice. What he found instead was another closed door, another denial, another bureaucrat telling him his pain wasn't real or wasn't service-connected. As Sarah spoke, Judge Harrison found himself studying the defendant more closely. Something about Marcus Thompson seemed familiar, though he couldn't place exactly what. The judge made a mental note to review the case file more thoroughly during the lunch recess. The morning proceeded with the prosecution calling its first witnesses. Officer Hayes took the stand, describing the events from his perspective. He spoke of arriving at the clinic to find Marcus agitated and confrontational. According to Hayes, Marcus had refused multiple requests to calm down and had threatened clinic staff before turning his aggression toward the officer. "I tried to de-escalate the situation," Hayes testified. "I used standard procedures, but the defendant was beyond reasoning with. When I attempted to place him under arrest for disturbing the peace, he struck me with his cane and then grabbed my baton." The officer's testimony was detailed and professional, but Sarah Chen's cross-examination revealed some important gaps. Hayes admitted he had no training in dealing with PTSD or veteran-specific issues. He also acknowledged that he had not asked Marcus about his military service or current mental state before attempting the arrest. As the first day of testimony concluded, Judge Harrison dismissed the jury with instructions to avoid media coverage of the case. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind the usual detritus of a high-profile trial, discarded note pages, empty coffee cups, and the lingering tension of competing narratives. Marcus remained seated as his lawyer gathered her materials. The weight of the day's proceedings showed in his posture, but his resolve appeared unshaken. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more attempts to reduce his service and his suffering to simple legal categories, but tonight, he would return to his small apartment and the memories that haunted his sleep, carrying the hope that somehow, justice might still prevail. The second day of trial began under a gray morning sky that seemed to mirror the somber mood inside the courthouse. Marcus arrived early, as was his habit from military days when punctuality meant survival. He sat in the defendant's chair, watching the courtroom fill with familiar faces, the prosecutor's team, court reporters, and the handful of veterans who had become his unofficial support group. Judge Harrison took his place behind the bench, having spent the previous evening reviewing Marcus Thompson's military records in detail. The file contained commendations, deployment histories, and medical reports that painted a picture of dedicated service followed by devastating injury. Yet something still nagged at the judge, a sense of recognition he couldn't quite place. Sarah Chen called her first witness, Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, a psychiatrist specializing in combat trauma. Dr. Martinez had evaluated Marcus extensively and was prepared to explain how PTSD could manifest in situations like the one at the VA clinic. PTSD is not simply feeling sad or anxious, Dr. Martinez explained to the jury. It involves fundamental changes to how the brain processes stress and threat. For combat veterans, certain triggers can cause them to react as if they're still in a war zone, even years after their service has ended. The prosecutor objected frequently during Dr. Martinez's testimony, arguing that mental health issues didn't excuse criminal behavior. But the doctor's calm, scientific explanations helped the jury understand the invisible wounds that many veterans carry home from war. In Mr. Thompson's case, Dr. Martinez continued, his medical records show multiple traumatic incidents during his deployments. The IED explosion that cost him his leg also resulted in a severe concussion and ongoing neurological symptoms. Combined with witnessing the deaths of close friends, these experiences created what we call complex PTSD. Sarah Chen guided the doctor through a detailed explanation of how the VA system's failures had exacerbated Marcus's condition. Each denied claim, each postponed appointment, each bureaucratic obstacle had added to his stress and sense of helplessness. By the day of the incident, Dr. Martinez testified, Mr. Thompson was in what we call a hypervigilant state. His brain was interpreting the situation at the clinic as a life-threatening crisis, triggering survival responses learned in combat. During cross-examination, District Attorney Patterson tried to undermine the doctor's testimony. Dr. Martinez, are you suggesting that every veteran with PTSD has the right to attack police officers when they don't get their way? Absolutely not, she replied firmly. I'm explaining the psychological factors that contributed to this specific incident. Mr. Thompson's actions weren't calculated or malicious. They were the result of a trauma response. The morning session continued with testimony from Marcus's former commanding officer, Colonel James Reed, who had flown in from Colorado to testify on his soldiers' behalf. The colonel, now retired, cut an impressive figure in his dress uniform, ribbons and decorations speaking to decades of distinguished service. Sergeant Thompson was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command, Colonel Reed testified. He volunteered for the most dangerous missions and never hesitated to put himself at risk to protect his fellow soldiers. The colonel described specific incidents where Marcus had shown exceptional courage and leadership. He spoke of a night patrol where Marcus had carried a wounded comrade to safety under enemy fire, and of his dedication to the younger soldiers in his unit. I've seen Sergeant Thompson in the worst possible conditions, the colonel said, his voice carrying the weight of shared experiences. He never broke under pressure, never abandoned his responsibilities, never thought of himself before his men. The man I knew would never hurt someone unless he genuinely believed he had no other choice. As Colonel Reed spoke, Judge Harrison found himself transported back to his own military days. The colonel's words about duty, sacrifice, and brotherhood resonated deeply, but there was something else, something about the specific details of Marcus's service that seemed almost familiar. The defense called several character witnesses throughout the day, fellow veterans who spoke of Marcus's volunteer work with homeless vets, a nurse from the VA hospital who described his patience and kindness despite his own pain, and his former physical therapist, who detailed his determined recovery from his injuries. Each witness painted a picture of a man who had given everything for his country and was now struggling to rebuild his life. They spoke of his quiet dignity, his refusal to complain despite chronic pain, and his dedication to helping other veterans navigate the same bureaucratic maze that had ensnared him. The prosecution's strategy became clear during their cross-examinations. They weren't denying Marcus's service or his sacrifices, but they argued that none of it justified violence against a police officer. Patterson repeatedly emphasized that the law applied equally to everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances. I respect Mr. Thompson's service, Patterson said during one cross-examination, but this trial isn't about what happened 20 years ago in a foreign country. It's about what happened 3 months ago outside a VA clinic. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah Chen prepared to call her most important witness, Marcus Thompson himself. The decision to have a defendant testify always carried risks, but Sarah believed Marcus's story needed to be told in his own words. Before court adjourned for the day, Sarah made an unusual request. She asked Judge Harrison for permission to present evidence about the specific incident that had ended Marcus's military career. The prosecution objected, arguing that it was irrelevant to the current charges. But Sarah insisted it was crucial for understanding her client's state of mind. Your Honor, Sarah argued, the incident that cost Mr. Thompson his leg involved split-second decisions under extreme pressure. Understanding how he performed under those circumstances is directly relevant to evaluating his actions at the VA clinic. Judge Harrison agreed to review the military records and incident reports overnight before ruling on the admissibility of the evidence. As the court recessed, the judge couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important, some connection that lay just beyond his conscious memory. That evening, Judge Harrison sat in his study at home, surrounded by case files and military documents. The incident report from Marcus's final mission made for difficult reading. The patrol had been ambushed while delivering supplies to a remote outpost. Multiple casualties, chaos, explosions, the kind of nightmare scenario that haunted military leaders and soldiers alike. As the judge read the detailed after-action report, specific names and locations began to trigger memories he had long suppressed. The outpost mentioned in the report was familiar. The date of the incident matched a period when his own unit had been operating in the same region. The pieces of a long-buried puzzle began to fall into place. Marcus Thompson had been part of the convoy that had saved Judge Harrison's isolated unit 25 years earlier. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He remembered that terrible week when his small communications unit had been cut off from the main force, surrounded by enemy fighters, running low on ammunition and medical supplies. He remembered the radio calls for help, the uncertainty about whether rescue would come in time, and he remembered the convoy that had fought through enemy lines to reach them. A determined group of soldiers led by a young sergeant who had refused to abandon fellow Americans in danger. That sergeant had been Marcus Thompson. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, the weight of recognition settling over him. The man accused of assault in his courtroom was the same man who had once risked everything to save his life and the lives of his soldiers. The irony was almost overwhelming. After all these years, their paths had crossed again under the most unexpected circumstances. The judge faced an immediate dilemma. Legal ethics required him to disclose any personal connection to a case. But this connection was so distant, so buried in the past, that he wondered if it truly constituted a conflict of interest. As he pondered his next move, Marcus Thompson's words from the military report echoed in his mind. "We don't leave anyone behind." Tomorrow, Judge Harrison would have to decide whether to recuse himself from the case or find another way to handle this extraordinary situation. The trial that had already captured national attention was about to take an even more dramatic turn. The third day of trial began with an unusual tension that seemed to emanate from the judge's bench. Judge Harrison had arrived at court that morning, carrying the weight of his discovery, his mind racing through the legal and ethical implications of his situation. He had spent sleepless hours wrestling with whether to reveal his connection to the defendant or find another way to ensure justice prevailed. Sarah Chen rose to call Marcus Thompson to testify on his own behalf. The courtroom fell silent as Marcus made his way to the witness stand, his prosthetic leg creating a subtle rhythm against the hardwood floor. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah began gently, "please tell the jury about your military service." Marcus straightened in the witness chair, his bearing reflecting the soldier he had once been. "I enlisted in the Army when I was 19 years old. Served for 12 years, did 3 combat deployments. I was a sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division." As Marcus spoke, Judge Harrison studied every detail of the man's face and mannerisms. The years had changed him, lines etched by pain and struggle, hair grayed by stress and trauma. But the core of the young sergeant who had led that rescue mission remained visible to someone who knew what to look for. "Can you describe the incident that ended your military career?" Sarah asked. Marcus's voice remained steady, but his hands tightened slightly on the arms of the witness chair. "We were on a supply run to Forward Operating Base Echo. It was supposed to be routine, but intelligence was wrong. We got hit by an IED about 2 clicks from the base, then came under small arms fire." He paused, collecting himself before continuing. "I was in the lead vehicle. The explosion threw me clear, but my leg was caught under the wreckage. My driver, Private Rodriguez, was unconscious and bleeding badly. The enemy was closing in and we had wounded men who couldn't move." Judge Harrison found himself holding his breath. This was the incident he remembered from the other side. The desperate radio calls, the sound of gunfire getting closer, the fear that help might not arrive in time. "What did you do then?" Sarah prompted. "I did what any soldier would do," Marcus replied simply. "I organized the defense, got the wounded to cover, and called for backup. We held that position for 6 hours until relief arrived. Lost 2 good men that day, but we saved 4 others who would have died without medical attention." The prosecutor had remained silent during this testimony, recognizing that attacking a war hero's service record would only alienate the jury. But as Marcus described the emotional aftermath of his injuries and discharge, Patterson prepared his cross-examination strategy. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah continued, "how did your military experience affect your civilian life?" For the first time, Marcus's composure cracked slightly. "The nightmares started in the hospital. Flashbacks, anxiety attacks when I heard loud noises. The doctors called it PTSD, but that's just a label for something that changes everything about who you are." He described his struggles with the VA system, appointments that were canceled or delayed, claims that were denied without explanation, medications that helped one symptom while creating others. Each obstacle had added to his frustration and sense of abandonment by the country he had served. By the time of the incident at the clinic, Marcus said, his voice growing quieter, I hadn't slept properly in weeks. My pain medication had been reduced because of new regulations, and I was in constant physical agony. I went to that clinic hoping someone would finally listen, finally help. Sarah guided him through the events of that March afternoon. Marcus's version differed significantly from the police report and Officer Hayes's testimony. According to Marcus, he had not threatened anyone initially. He had simply raised his voice in frustration when told his appointment was canceled again. The security guard got aggressive first, Marcus testified. He grabbed my arm and tried to force me out. That's when my training kicked in. In my mind, I wasn't in a clinic anymore. I was back in that ambush surrounded by hostile forces. Judge Harrison listened intently as Marcus described the psychological state that had led to the confrontation. The defendant's words painted a picture of a man reliving combat trauma, not a criminal calculating violence. When Officer Hayes arrived, Marcus continued, he didn't try to talk to me or understand what was happening. He immediately moved to arrest me, and when he reached for his handcuffs, something in my brain interpreted that as a threat. I reacted the way I was trained to react when someone tried to restrain me in a hostile environment. The cross-examination that followed was intense but respectful. District Attorney Patterson walked a careful line, acknowledging Marcus's service while maintaining that trauma didn't excuse assault. Mr. Thompson, you testified that you reacted based on your training, Patterson said, but wasn't part of your military training learning to follow orders and respect authority? Yes, sir, it was, Marcus replied. But another part of my training was survival. When your brain thinks you're under attack, survival instincts override everything else. Patterson pressed harder. But you weren't actually under attack, were you? You were in a medical clinic dealing with administrative staff and a police officer doing his job. Marcus met the prosecutor's gaze directly. With respect, sir, PTSD doesn't operate on logic. My rational mind knew I was in a clinic, but my trauma response was telling me I was in danger. As the afternoon progressed, Judge Harrison found himself in an impossible position. He was witnessing the trial of a man who had once saved his life, listening to testimony about the very incident that had forged an unbreakable bond between soldiers. Yet he was bound by his oath as a judge to remain impartial and follow the law. During a brief recess, Judge Harrison called both attorneys to his chambers. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the door behind them, knowing that his next words would change everything. Counselors, he began, his voice carefully controlled, I need to inform you of something that has come to my attention regarding this case. Sarah Chen and District Attorney Patterson exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of the moment but unable to anticipate what was coming. 25 years ago, the judge continued, I served as a lieutenant in the Army. My unit was stationed at Forward Operating Base Echo. He paused, allowing the significance of that location to register. I believe Mr. Thompson was part of the convoy that rescued my unit during an enemy siege. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah Chen's eyes widened as she processed the implications, while Patterson's face showed a mixture of surprise and concern about how this revelation might affect the trial's outcome. Your Honor, Patterson said carefully, this would seem to constitute a significant conflict of interest. Judge Harrison nodded gravely. That's why I'm bringing it to your attention. I have several options. I can recuse myself and request a new judge, which would likely mean a mistrial and starting over in several months. Or I can continue to preside if both parties waive any potential conflict, understanding that my military connection to the defendant will be made known to the jury. Sarah Chen's mind raced through the possibilities. A new trial would mean months more of preparation and uncertainty for her client. But continuing with Judge Harrison, who now knew firsthand about Marcus's heroism, might create a more favorable atmosphere for the defense, Your Honor, she said slowly. I would need to discuss this with my client, but I believe we would be willing to waive the conflict if the prosecution agrees. Patterson found himself in a difficult position. Requesting a new judge might seem like prosecutorial misconduct, especially if the story of the judge's military connection to the defendant became public. Yet continuing with a judge who owed his life to the defendant hardly seemed ideal for the prosecution. I need time to consider this, Patterson said. and I'll need to consult with my superiors about the best way to proceed. Judge Harrison looked at both attorneys with the weight of decades of legal experience. I'll give you both until tomorrow morning to decide. If either party objects to my continued involvement, I'll recuse myself immediately. But I want you to understand something. Regardless of my personal history with Mr. Thompson, I took an oath to uphold the law fairly and impartially. That oath means more to me than any personal feelings. As the attorneys left his chambers, Judge Harrison remained alone with his thoughts. The soldier in him wanted to save Marcus Thompson just as Marcus had once saved him. But the judge in him knew that justice required more than gratitude. It demanded truth, fairness, and adherence to the principles that made the legal system trustworthy. Tomorrow would bring a decision that would either end the trial in mistrial or transform it into something unprecedented in American legal history. The courthouse buzzed with unusual activity the next morning, as word of the judge's revelation had somehow leaked to the media overnight. Reporters gathered outside, sensing that something extraordinary was developing in what had already been a high-profile case. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and uncertainty. Judge Harrison arrived early and spent an hour in his chambers, reviewing legal precedents for judges with personal connections to defendants. The cases he found were few and far between, and none involved circumstances quite like his. He had made his decision about how to proceed, but implementing it would require careful navigation of both legal ethics and human emotions. Marcus Thompson sat in the defendant's chair, unaware of the previous day's revelation in the judge's chambers. Sarah Chen had spent most of the night debating whether to tell her client about the judge's military connection. She had ultimately decided to wait until she knew how the court would proceed. District Attorney Patterson arrived looking haggard, having spent hours on conference calls with his supervisors and legal advisors. The decision about how to handle the judge's disclosure had created a dilemma with no clear right answer. Requesting a new judge might look like the prosecution was afraid of losing, but continuing with a judge who owed his life to the defendant seemed equally problematic. When court convened, Judge Harrison addressed the packed courtroom with unusual formality. Before we proceed with today's testimony, I need to make an important disclosure to the jury and all parties present. The courtroom fell silent, every person straining to hear what the judge would say next. Even the court reporter seemed to lean forward in anticipation. 25 years ago, I had the honor of serving my country as an Army lieutenant, Judge Harrison began. During that service, I found myself in a situation where American soldiers came to the aid of my unit during a dangerous combat operation. Marcus Thompson's head snapped up, his eyes meeting the judge's for the first time since the trial began. In that moment, recognition flickered across his face as memories of that long-ago rescue mission came flooding back. After careful review of military records and consultation with both attorneys, the judge continued, I have determined that the defendant, Marcus Thompson, was the sergeant who led the convoy that saved my unit and several American lives, including my own. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Several jurors sat back in shock, while the gallery erupted in whispered conversations until the bailiff called for order. Marcus sat stunned, his mind racing to process this impossible coincidence. Now, Judge Harrison said, raising his voice to restore order. Both parties have agreed to waive any conflict of interest, understanding that this information will be part of the record. I want to assure everyone present that my personal gratitude to Mr. Thompson will not interfere with my duty to ensure a fair trial under the law. Sarah Chen rose from her seat. Your Honor, the defense appreciates the court's transparency and agrees to proceed. Patterson stood as well, though his agreement came with obvious reluctance. The prosecution also agrees to proceed, Your Honor. With the disclosure complete, the trial resumed, but the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally changed. The judge was no longer just an impartial arbiter. He was a man whose life had been saved by the defendant decades earlier. The defense called its final witness, Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in military psychology who had studied the long-term effects of combat heroism on veterans. Her testimony was designed to explain how the very qualities that made Marcus a hero in combat could contribute to his struggles with civilian authority. Soldiers, who excel in combat situations, often possess heightened protective instincts and rapid threat assessment abilities, Dr. Foster explained. These traits save lives in war zones but can become problematic in civilian contexts, especially when combined with PTSD. She described how heroes of war often struggled more than other veterans with the transition to civilian life. The psychological profile of soldiers who perform extraordinary acts of courage shows they're willing to take extreme risks to protect others. But that same willingness to act decisively under pressure can manifest as apparent aggression when they perceive threats in civilian situations. The prosecution's final witnesses focused on the need for law and order. They called additional police officers who testified about the importance of respecting law enforcement, regardless of circumstances. A VA administrator testified about proper procedures for filing complaints and appeals, suggesting that Marcus had other options besides confrontation. But the prosecution's case seemed to lose momentum in the face of the judge's revelation. Patterson's closing argument was technically sound but lacked the moral authority it had possessed before the courtroom learned that the defendant had once saved the judge's life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson argued, "we must not let emotion override justice. Mr. Thompson's heroic service is admirable, but it doesn't give him the right to assault a police officer. The law must apply equally to everyone regardless of their background." Sarah Chen's closing argument was passionate and personal. She spoke directly to the human cost of war and the failure of society to properly care for its veterans. "Marcus Thompson has already given everything for this country," she declared. "He gave his youth, his health, his peace of mind, and his leg. He saved American lives, including the life of the man who sits behind that bench. Now we're asked to send him to prison for a moment of trauma-induced confusion that hurt no one permanently and damaged only property." She paused, making eye contact with each juror. "The question before you isn't whether Marcus Thompson struck Officer Hayes. He did. The question is whether a hero who has sacrificed everything deserves our understanding and help, or our condemnation and punishment." As closing arguments concluded, Judge Harrison faced the most difficult decision of his judicial career. Legal precedent suggested that his instructions to the jury should focus purely on the elements of the charges, without regard to the defendant's military service or their personal connection. But the judge also understood that justice sometimes required more than strict adherence to procedure. He had witnessed firsthand the courage and selflessness that Marcus Thompson possessed, and he knew that the system had failed this veteran long before the incident at the VA clinic. In his instructions to the jury, Judge Harrison carefully balanced his legal obligations with his human understanding of the case. He explained the charges clearly and outlined the prosecution's burden of proof, but he also instructed the jury about the legal concept of justification and the role that mental state could play in determining criminal intent. "You must consider all the evidence presented," he told the jury, "including Mr. Thompson's state of mind at the time of the incident and any factors that may have influenced his actions. The law recognizes that people sometimes act under extraordinary circumstances that affect their judgment and perception of events." As the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom remained tense with anticipation. The case had become about much more than a simple assault charge. It had become a referendum on how society treats its veterans and whether the sacrifices of military service create any special consideration under the law. Marcus Thompson sat quietly at the defense table, still processing the incredible revelation about the judge's identity. He remembered that desperate radio call from Forward Operating Base Echo, the urgency in the lieutenant's voice as he described their deteriorating situation. He remembered the decision to push through enemy lines despite the risks, driven by the military creed that no soldier gets left behind. Now, 25 years later, that same lieutenant was in a position to ensure that Marcus Thompson wouldn't be left behind by the justice system. But whether Judge Harrison would find a way to balance his personal gratitude with his judicial responsibilities remained to be seen. The jury deliberation would determine not just Marcus's fate, but whether the American legal system could accommodate the complexities of military service and the invisible wounds of war. As the hours passed, everyone in the courthouse waited to see if justice and mercy could coexist in a single verdict. The jury deliberation stretched through the afternoon and into the evening, creating an atmosphere of mounting tension throughout the courthouse. In the jury room, 12 citizens wrestled with questions that went far beyond the simple facts of the case. They faced a decision that would impact not just Marcus Thompson's future, but would send a message about how society values military sacrifice and treats veterans struggling with invisible wounds. Juror number 3, a retired teacher named Margaret Walsh, had emerged as an unofficial leader during the deliberations. She had served on juries before and understood the weight of their responsibility. "We need to focus on the law," she reminded the others repeatedly. "Our personal feelings can't override our duty." But juror number 7, a young construction worker named David Park, pushed back against that interpretation. "How can we ignore what this man did for our country? He saved lives, including the judge's life. Doesn't that count for something?" The jury foreman, a middle-aged accountant named Robert Chen, tried to keep the discussion focused on the evidence. "The question isn't whether Mr. Thompson is a hero," he said. "The question is whether he committed assault on that day at the clinic." Around the deliberation table, 12 different perspectives emerged. Some jurors focused on the letter of the law, arguing that good intentions didn't excuse violence. Others emphasized the circumstances that had driven Marcus to his breaking point, seeing his actions as the result of a system that had failed him rather than criminal intent. Juror number 9, a nurse named Patricia Williams, had been deeply moved by the testimony about PTSD and combat trauma. "I work with veterans at the hospital," she shared. "I see what these men and women go through every day. The flashbacks, the hypervigilance, the way their brains get stuck in survival mode. This wasn't a criminal choosing to commit violence. This was a sick man having a medical crisis." But juror number 11, a retired police officer named Frank Rodriguez, offered a different perspective. "I sympathize with Mr. Thompson's situation, I really do. But I've been in Officer Hayes's position. When someone strikes a police officer, there have to be consequences. Otherwise, we're saying that some people are above the law." The deliberation continued well past normal court hours. Judge Harrison waited in his chambers, reviewing case law and preparing for whatever verdict the jury might reach. He had done everything possible to ensure a fair trial, while navigating the extraordinary circumstances of his personal connection to the defendant. Sarah Chen remained in the courthouse, using the time to prepare for potential sentencing arguments. She had compiled extensive documentation of Marcus's military service, his volunteer work with other veterans, and letters of support from his community. If the jury found him guilty, she was prepared to argue for the minimum possible sentence. District Attorney Patterson also waited, though with less certainty about the outcome he wanted. The case had become more complex than a simple assault prosecution. The revelation about the judge's connection to the defendant had transformed the trial into something unprecedented, and Patterson wasn't sure whether a conviction would serve justice or create a public relations nightmare for his office. Back in the jury room, the discussion had evolved beyond the simple facts of the case. The jurors found themselves debating larger questions about military service, mental health, and the obligations of society to care for its veterans. "My grandfather served in World War II," said juror number 5, a young teacher named Lisa Martinez. "He never talked about what he went through, but my grandmother told me he had nightmares for decades. Back then, they didn't have names for what we now call PTSD. They just expected soldiers to come home and act like nothing had happened." The retired police officer, Frank Rodriguez, nodded thoughtfully. "I'm not saying we should excuse criminal behavior, but maybe we need to understand that some people are dealing with things the rest of us can't imagine." As midnight approached, the jury remained divided. Some members felt strongly that Marcus's actions, while understandable, still constituted assault under the law. Others believed that his mental state at the time of the incident negated criminal intent. A few wanted to send a message about society's obligations to veterans by finding him not guilty. Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher, made one final attempt to find common ground. "What if we ask ourselves this question? If this had been your son, your brother, your father who had served and sacrificed and was struggling with these demons, what would you want 12 strangers to decide about his fate?" The question hung in the air, forcing each juror to consider the case not as abstract legal concepts but as a human story, involving real people with real consequences. One by one, they began to reach a consensus that surprised them all. The next morning, after nearly 18 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courthouse filled quickly as news of the decision spread. Media trucks lined the street outside, and veterans groups gathered to show support for Marcus Thompson. Judge Harrison took his place behind the bench, his expression carefully neutral despite the turmoil of emotions he felt. Marcus stood between his attorney and the bailiff, his hands clasped behind his back in a military posture he had maintained throughout the trial. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harrison asked. Robert Chen, the foreman, stood with a piece of paper in his trembling hand. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of assault on a police officer, how do you find?" The courtroom held its collective breath as Chen unfolded the paper. "We find the defendant not guilty." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Gasps of surprise echoed through the gallery, followed by spontaneous applause from the veterans in attendance. Marcus Thompson's knees buckled slightly, and Sarah Chen had to steady him as the full impact of the verdict registered. "On the charge of destruction of public property, how do you find?" The judge continued. "We find the defendant guilty," Chen replied. The mixed verdict reflected the jury's careful consideration of the evidence and their attempt to balance justice with mercy. They had acknowledged that Marcus had indeed damaged the patrol car while refusing to criminalize his reaction to a mental health crisis. Judge Harrison called for order in the courtroom before addressing the jury. "Thank you for your service in this difficult case. You are dismissed with the court's gratitude." As the jurors filed out, several made eye contact with Marcus, their expressions conveying sympathy and respect rather than judgment. They had seen beyond the surface facts to understand the deeper story of a man broken by service to his country and failed by the system he had sacrificed to protect. The sentencing phase would come later, but everyone in the courtroom understood that the real verdict had already been delivered. The jury had refused to treat Marcus Thompson as a common criminal, instead recognizing him as a veteran struggling with wounds that society was only beginning to understand. Outside the courthouse, the veterans who had supported Marcus throughout the trial celebrated the not guilty verdict on the assault charge. They understood that while he still faced consequences for the property damage, the jury had rejected the prosecution's attempt to paint him as a dangerous criminal. District Attorney Patterson left the courthouse without comment, but his expression suggested that he wasn't entirely disappointed with the outcome. The case had highlighted important issues about veteran care and mental health that transcended simple criminal justice concerns. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Judge Harrison remained behind the bench, contemplating the remarkable journey that had brought him face to face with the man who had saved his life 25 years earlier. The trial was nearly over, but its impact would resonate far beyond the courthouse walls. 2 weeks after the verdict, the courthouse was quieter but no less significant as Judge Harrison prepared to deliver Marcus Thompson's sentence for the property damage conviction. The media attention had continued, but the circus atmosphere of the trial had given way to a more reflective consideration of the issues the case had raised. Marcus sat in the same chair where he had spent days as a defendant, but his posture was different now. The burden of potential imprisonment for assault had been lifted, leaving only the lesser charge that carried a maximum sentence of 1 year in jail and restitution for the damaged patrol car. Sarah Chen had spent the intervening weeks preparing an extensive sentencing memorandum that detailed Marcus's military service, his struggles with the VA system, and the support he had received from the veteran community. Character letters poured in from fellow soldiers, volunteer organizations, and community members who had witnessed his quiet dignity and determination to help others despite his own pain. District Attorney Patterson had also submitted his sentencing recommendation, but it was notably measured compared to his trial advocacy. The mixed verdict had sent a clear message that the community didn't view Marcus as a typical criminal, and Patterson had adjusted his approach accordingly. The gallery was filled with familiar faces, the veterans who had attended every day of the trial, Marcus's family members who had flown in from across the country, and members of the media who had followed the case from its beginning. But there were also new faces, advocates for veteran rights, mental health professionals, and citizens who had been moved by the story of a hero failed by the system he had served. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom carrying not just the weight of legal precedent, but the knowledge that his decision would be watched by veterans across the country. The case had become a symbol of broader issues: how society treats its warriors when they return home wounded, how the justice system addresses the invisible scars of combat, and whether mercy and justice could coexist in a single decision. "Mr. Thompson, please rise," Judge Harrison said. his voice carrying both authority and something else, a depth of understanding born from shared experience. Marcus stood, flanked by Sarah Chen and supported by the knowledge that whatever happened next, he had been heard and understood by a jury of his peers. The court has reviewed the extensive documentation submitted by both parties. Judge Harrison began. I have read dozens of character letters, military commendations, medical reports, and expert analyses of your condition and circumstances. He paused, looking directly at Marcus with an expression that conveyed both judicial authority and personal recognition of their shared history. Mr. Thompson, 25 years ago, you took an oath to defend this country and protect your fellow soldiers. You honored that oath with distinction, courage, and sacrifice. The convoy you led to Forward Operating Base Echo demonstrated the finest traditions of military service, the unwillingness to abandon fellow Americans in their hour of greatest need. The courtroom was completely silent, hanging on every word as the judge continued. But today, I must address your actions on March 15th at the Veterans Administration Clinic. While the jury found your reaction understandable in the context of your service-connected mental health condition, they also found that you did damage public property in a moment of crisis. Judge Harrison picked up a document from his desk, his hand steady despite the emotion in his voice. The prosecution has recommended a sentence of 6 months in jail plus restitution. The defense has asked for time served and community service. After careful consideration of all factors, including your military record, your ongoing struggle with PTSD, your lack of prior criminal history, and the unique circumstances of this case, the court sentences you as follows. He looked up from the document, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. You are sentenced to time served, meaning you will not go to jail. You will pay restitution in the amount of $200 for the damage to the patrol car. Additionally, you will perform 200 hours of community service, which I am directing you to complete by volunteering with veteran support organizations. Relief washed over Marcus's face, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, Mr. Thompson, I am ordering the court to facilitate your connection with appropriate mental health resources and to monitor your progress for the next year, not as punishment, but as support. The system failed you once. This court will not allow that to happen again. The judge set down the sentencing document and spoke from the heart. 25 years ago, you saved my life and the lives of other American soldiers. Today, I hope this court has helped save yours. But the real work of healing, both for you and for our society's treatment of veterans, begins now. Marcus Thompson, the decorated sergeant who had once carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire, finally broke down and wept. Sarah Chen placed a supportive hand on his shoulder as the courtroom erupted in sustained applause. Judge Harrison allowed the emotional release to continue for several moments before gaveling for order. As the courtroom settled, he delivered his final remarks. This case has highlighted critical issues about veteran care, mental health services, and the intersection of military service with civilian justice. I encourage all parties to use the attention this case has received to advocate for better support systems for our veterans. In the months that followed, the case of People vs. Thompson became a catalyst for significant changes. The local VA clinic implemented new protocols for handling agitated veterans, including mandatory de-escalation training for security personnel and improved access to mental health crisis intervention. Officer Hayes, the policeman Marcus had struck, underwent additional training in veteran-specific response techniques. He later testified before the city council about the need for specialized approaches when dealing with veterans in crisis, becoming an unexpected advocate for better training and resources. Marcus Thompson completed his community service working with a homeless veterans program, using his experience to help other soldiers navigate the challenges of civilian life. His story became part of training materials for VA counselors and police academies across the country. District Attorney Patterson quietly revised his office's policies regarding veteran defendants, implementing procedures for early mental health assessment and diversion programs for nonviolent offenses committed by individuals with service-connected disabilities. The trial had revealed uncomfortable truths about how society treats its veterans after their service ends. But it also demonstrated that the justice system, at its best, could acknowledge complexity, show mercy without abandoning accountability, and recognized that true justice sometimes requires looking beyond the simple facts of a case to understand the human story behind it. Judge Harrison continued to serve on the bench for several more years, but colleagues noticed a subtle change in his approach to cases involving veterans. He established a veterans court in his jurisdiction, creating specialized programs designed to address the unique needs of former service members who found themselves in legal trouble. The case became required reading in law schools as an example of how personal experience and judicial ethics could intersect without compromising the integrity of the legal system. It demonstrated that judges, like all human beings, bring their own experiences to their work, and that sometimes those experiences can enhance rather than compromise their ability to deliver justice. Marcus Thompson never forgot that a twist of fate had brought him face to face with the man whose life he had saved decades earlier. But more importantly, he never forgot that a courtroom full of strangers had listened to his story, understood his struggle, and chosen compassion over condemnation. The trial had ended, but its message endured, that in a nation built on principles of justice and equality, there is room for both accountability and mercy, for both law and humanity. Sometimes the most important verdicts are not about guilt or innocence, but about whether we have the wisdom to see beyond the surface of human actions to the complex realities that drive them. In saving Judge Harrison's life 25 years earlier, Marcus Thompson had performed an act of heroism that exemplified the best of military service. In refusing to criminalize his moment of trauma-induced crisis, the justice system had performed an act of wisdom that exemplified the best of American jurisprudence. The trial was over, but the work of healing, for Marcus, for the veterans community, and for society's understanding of the true cost of military service, would continue for years to come.